Welcome to Culture Talk, where we talk about how culturally relevant topics can be used to start conversations about the Christian faith. Joining me today is Hugh Ross, astronomer and author, and today we're going to be talking about something that you call default atheism. First, thank you for joining us, Hugh.
Oh, my pleasure.
So let's talk about default atheism. What does that mean?
Well, I use that as a term for someone who identifies himself as an atheist who really hasn't thought about the issues that are relevant to the philosophy of atheism. So it's default in the sense they just haven't thought about it.
Right. Well, and that makes sense. Like you kind of tell this story about default atheism as you talk about an interaction that you had a few years ago at, was it a convention?
It was an Origin of Life research conference.
Conference. I'm too used to comic convention, so I use that word. But you bring up the topic of default atheism, and you say that some scientists feel like they might have this default view, and that any scientist really has the default view of atheism. And likewise, they might assume that the default view for Christians is young Earth creationism. So how would you go about kind of addressing that misperception before you dive into the default atheism?
Oh, you're right. I mean, I ran into these scientists that says, well, I'm a scientist, therefore I must be an atheist. And then when they found out I was a Christian, they assumed, oh, you must believe that the universe is only a few thousand years old. And so that begins a door of opportunity to say, you know what, there's a range of different views from a Christian perspective. Identifying myself as an old earth creationist who nonetheless takes the Bible seriously and inerrantly. And that raised a lot of questions from their perspective. And then I asked them questions. I mean, you say you're a scientist, therefore you're an atheist. Have you actually thought through these issues? Is there purpose in the universe? Just ask them a bunch of questions. I think what really shocked me was these people who called themselves atheists had never really thought about the issue of their coming death.
Yeah, and that's a good kind of way to start conversations with people, is to really ask questions. People really like talking about themselves, but also it helps to, one, like define our terms. What do we mean by these worldviews? And is that your worldview? So when it comes to interacting with scientists and this idea of default atheism, or what sort of questions would you ask an atheist, someone who identifies as an atheist? What would you ask them to determine whether they are resulting to default atheism?
Well, I'd ask a question like, do you think science can be used as a tool to test different worldview perspectives? I mean, it seems to me you believe that science is a powerful tool to rule out young earth creationism. Could it actually be used to evaluate other bad belief systems? And what about this idea of atheism? I mean, is there any scientific evidence to support an atheistic worldview that gets them thinking? So questions like that.
Yeah. And, I think it's important to, like you're saying, to ask these questions about kind of what their perspective leads them to when they think about these big questions of life. And then also to show kind of science's role in their worldview and also its role in your worldview. Because again, when we go back to those misperceptions, they might think, hey, this guy doesn't really respect science. So if you start on that common ground of respecting science, it's a good way to kind of unpack what their worldview is and then see if there's maybe a little bit more common ground. So when we think about science and your mutual love of science with these fellow scientists, a common comment is that science isn't supposed to answer the why questions. It'll tell you how, but it won't tell you why. So how does that fit with the human experience and the big questions that we ask?
Well, I'll bring up questions like, do you think that the universe is fine-tuned to make life possible? Virtually every scientist I've engaged has said, yes, it does. Well, why? And why is the fine-tuning more dramatic for humans than it is for bacteria? Does that indicate or suggest that there might be purpose behind the universe being the way it is? And do you think that science reveals elegance and beauty? And again, most scientists would say yes. And when I follow it up and say, well, why do we see ubiquitous beauty and elegance throughout all the sciences? Or why do you think there's such great consistency amongst all the sciences? So let's get some thinking again. Gee, there's more to science than just the data.
Right. So then what is the next step? Let's say you're having that conversation with the scientist and they're saying, okay, I do recognize that there's fine tuning. And I do recognize that with regard to humanity, we see it at a much greater level than we see it for bacteria. So there's something very special about humans. What would be the next step for them? How would you invite them to continue exploring kind of the design that we see in nature and how that harmonizes with a Christian perspective?
Well, I'd ask them a question. In your ongoing studies of science, do you recognize that there seems to be increasing evidence for this fine-tuning design for human benefit as we learn more and more? And most of them will say yes. And again, well, why is that the case? And they would often ask me a question: what do you think is going on here? And I said, well, as a Christian, I see these texts in the Bible that tell us the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we'll see for the handiwork of God. And at this Origin of Life conference, someone was actually talking about what they call the hand of God dilemma. So it was relevant to what they were hearing right there. But also find that I gain a lot of credibility just being fluent with the scientific literature. That's what really opened the door. They assumed that since I was a Christian, I was fairly ignorant about science. I wasn't keeping up. But when they realized that our research scientists actually publish articles on a weekly basis on the latest scientific discoveries, I mean, that really opened the door and says, it seems like you're reading the literature more than we do.
Right.
And that began, and what I noticed was just spending that time with them on the scientific issues, they began to ask Bible and theology questions.
Yeah.
I remember there's one MIT research scientist, very famous. She walked back with us to our dormitories, but for 20 minutes she was asking Bible questions. And so it's like, okay, if you give a really good scientific defense of your Christian faith, that will often lead people into the biblical and theological issues, and eventually
Yeah.
to them considering what Christ offers through his redemptive sacrifice.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, Hugh. There's a lot to unpack. You certainly are well versed in the literature, and our readers and viewers can see how by going to reasons.org and searching for your blog, Today's New Reason to Believe. And they can also search for default atheism to just get more on this topic. But it's a lot to unpack. So thank you again, Hugh, for joining us.
You're very welcome.